This is Teaching for Student Success. I'm Stephen Robineau. For those that have been paying attention, the Academy has been hearing about the benefits of active learning for decades. A 2014 meta-analysis by Scott Freeman and colleagues of 225 peer-reviewed studies concludes that students taught in an active learning environment significantly outperform peers taught using more traditional formats. These student-centered learning environments also frequently support disproportionately our marginalized, minoritized, and historically excluded students. We are a long way from full adoption of these practices. The reasons are complex. Resistance comes from institutions and often from faculty, but also from students. Our students have been trained to sit quietly, take notes, and learn from the lecture. Oh, yes, of course, we encourage them to read the book in advance and study, study, study. In this episode, we will discuss an elegant study that again tests the value of active learning, but importantly then pays attention to the student perspective and provides suggestions about getting students on board the active learning bandwagon. In this episode, Louis Deslauriers will discuss his 2019 paper, Measuring Actual Learning versus Feeling of Learning in Response to Being Actively Engaged in the Classroom, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS, with co-authors Logan McCarty, Kelly Miller, Christina Callahan, and Greg Keston. This publication very nicely documents and discusses student performance and student attitudes in a very controlled situation, comparing an active learning environment versus a traditional lecture format. The study is unique in its controlled design and provides interesting insights into the student perspective and how faculty might help students better understand the benefits of a novel and challenging student-centered classroom. Louis Deslauriers is the Director of Science Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and a Senior Preceptor in Physics at Harvard University. Welcome, Louis. Thank you for joining us on Teaching for Student Success.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you. All right, so let's start with your motivation to write this paper. There are lots of studies on active learning. What prompted you to undertake your study, and in what way is your data different?
Yeah, well, there's a few reasons why I wanted to do something like that. But primarily, it's what you notice whenever you implement active learning from students. You notice there's some resistance to it. And the resistance tends to fade away after the first month or two. That's assuming that you're really well-trained and you're implementing it correctly. But still, there are really issues at the beginning of a semester. It just so happens that I learned quite a bit about memory research and cognitive psychology. And this notion of feeling of learning is something I was quite familiar with. So I figured that this was involved at least as an important factor in explaining this initial resistance that students have. So the hope that I had here is that we'd be able to measure something to show that in fact it plays a role. And if it does play a role, then now it opens up the possibility of fixing that. And if you can fix the first third of a semester, this is likely to have a very high impact on learning. So that's the idea.
Absolutely. Agreed. Let's talk about your design, because the design is important. One of the comments you, in fact, make in your paper that many previous studies, the controls are imperfect. It's really hard to get a perfect control. But your experimental design here is very different. So could you take a little time to describe what you did? Because in this case, we're only talking about 2 lectures, 2 class periods in the middle of, actually very late, probably 2/3 of the way through a semester. Mm-hmm. We're only going to talk about 2 class periods, 12 weeks into a 15-week semester.
That's right.
Could you talk about how you set this up so everybody understands that?
Yeah, so the study took place over 1 week. And you're right, it was in the 12th week of the semester. Even I did not remember that. Yeah, so we ran the study twice, 2 subsequent years, 2 different courses. We did a crossover design, which means that the first learning session, we randomly assigned students to the active treatment and the other half to the traditional treatment. And then in the second learning session, then we reverse the roles. Right? Students who are assigned to the active treatment now were assigned to the traditional treatment. So also we changed instructors as well, just to control for the content, control for the instructor. Yeah, so there were a lot of other controls. We measured several aspects of students. Like, for example, there were already 2 midterms in the course. We also used a very well-known, in fact, the most well-known concept inventory in physics. It's called the Force Concept Inventory. It's a concept survey, basically, that just tests students' general understanding of important concepts in mechanics. And that's often used as a way to characterize, basically, students. And so we did that. So we controlled for that. We also controlled for students' perception of physics. So that's using another validated survey. It's called the class survey. So yeah, so we control for many different measures here.
Right. Let me just go through that again. So in 1 week, they had 2 class sessions. So students would be split up into 2 groups, and one group went with Professor A, who taught the exact same content in an active format. The other professor in another room taught a strictly lecture format using exactly the same materials. So students saw all the same stuff. And these were with instructors that were not the normal instructor for the course. So these are 2 totally different instructors. And those instructors had been trained specifically for this activity. Later that week, on the second session, they flipped. Instructor A, if they taught actively the first time, then they taught passively the second time. They gave lecture only, and instructor B taught actively. So you got both instructors, all highly trained for this specific situation, and you had 2 different topics, as you said.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay.
So there is one thing I want to emphasize, which for me was the most important control that I don't think many people notice or at least appreciate. So of all studies that I'm aware of that compare the effectiveness of active learning versus traditional lectures, they use different, learning materials. So this time around, when students came into the classroom, they were handed the same exact in-class activities, a packet basically. So during the active learning session, then of course students went through the activities first as a group, then the instructor provided feedback on the first activity, then they went back as a group to do activity 2, then instructor just gave the feedback on the second activity, and so forth until the end of the session. In the traditional session, students had the exact same packet, the same material, but now the instructor very fluently, very smoothly went through the activities. So we made sure that the information that was delivered to students was the same. So think about that for a second. I mean, we can expand on that later here, but the brains receive the exact same information, and yet in one condition, they learn more.
Absolutely. So we will come back to that. And I want to come back. We will come back to this. You mentioned the word fluency. So through this paper, you use the term cognitive fluency, and we're going to come back and talk about that cognitive fluency. And the other thing is, as you said, in the active learning environment, the students work, then the instructor goes over a solution. So there is a period of time where the instructor does speak multiple times throughout that active learning session as well.
That's correct. That's important, yes.
Yeah, so I just want to take a little time for that. So you then go ahead and you measure after students have this, after each experience, after each day, they get a test on what they've learned that day.
Yeah, first they get just a 2-3 minute, let's call it feeling of learning survey, where they're being asked questions like, I enjoyed this lecture. I feel like I learned a great deal from that. It just takes 2-3 minutes to answer. And this is followed by, let's call it a mini midterm, right? It's a test of learning. So for each session, this is what follows.
And students, again, I think this is actually important because it's an aspect of the pressure. Students are told that this test has no bearing on their grade. We're just measuring what you learned that day. This is just for information. This isn't going to affect your grade. Do your best.
In fact, not only that, we went further. These two topics during that week were not going to be tested on the final exam.
Ah, interesting.
So very low stake.
Very low stakes exam. Okay, so let's talk about the findings.
Sure.
Let's talk about learning. What happened?
Well, on the one hand, of course, students learn more from, with the active learning format. And I'd love to discuss the kind of active learning that we use, because that's important to the study, actually. Or at least it's important to how you interpret the study. So that's not surprising. But again, I want to remind you that students in both conditions, they were exposed to the exact same information. So it is pretty amazing that they learn more in one condition versus the other. Not surprising to me as a practitioner, but still pretty amazing.
Right. So the students in the active learning environment learn more, as we would have expected from the 225 plus studies, from the decades of work out there on active learning. The full expectation that a well done active learning moment, lecture, course, class time, the students are going to learn more. So no surprise there. So they learn more. Now let's talk about how they feel about it.
Yeah. Students' feeling of learning was not correlated with how much they actually learned. So students in the traditional lectures, they perceive that they just learn more from them. But I must say, it's not like the feeling of learning was very low for the active learning treatment. It was in fact fairly high for both of them. It just so happens that when you have a traditional lecture that's given by someone that's playing the role of a superstar traditional lecturer, then it's really hard for this cognitive bias not to really play a role here.
Right. The instructors lectured were excellent at it. So they gave a great, fluent, compelling lecture.
Yeah, that was an important part of the study. Yeah.
Yeah, you really tried to maximize both situations.
That's correct.
Students recognized, where you look at their feeling of learning, they all feel like they've learned, but there's still a significant difference between the lecture and the active learning. So they still prefer the lecture.
Yeah. I must say, this is a bit anecdotal, but for me, whenever I teach a physics course that's a service course, like, for example, physics for life science majors, large course, and there are some constraints on how much material you need to cover. Right? You need to cover quite a bit of material, which means that when I use active learning, which of course I do all the time, then sometimes I run behind. And when I run behind, then I switch from active learning to a traditional lecture format. I don't like to do that, but sometimes I have to do that. Let's say in the last third of a lecture, if things went too slow on that day. And sometimes I'm having a good day, which means that I'm a little bit like, say, a superstar traditional lecturer. Like sometimes I'm just very fluent. Not right now, but sometimes in the classroom, I'm very fluent. So, and on that days when that happens, I always have those, what I call 1-minute papers. So at the end of lecture, students have to give feedback on the lecture. And whenever that happens, I mean, this has been going on for years. Students will often write, I know I'm supposed to learn more from active learning. However, the last part of the lecture today, I feel like I learned a lot. I mean, literally, I get that all the time. So it's anecdotal, but it shows that this issue there is at play.
So let's talk about that. I'm going to call it a paradox. Let's talk about that paradox between what students learn and what they feel they learn. And the anecdote you just told, it persists even when they know better.
Yeah.
Even when intellectually you have told them, and they probably pretty well believe it in your courses, that the active learning is going to provide better learning opportunities for them. They're going to learn it more deeply. They're going to learn it longer. They know this. Nonetheless, in your course, those times when you do lecture, they can't get away from the comfort of that, and the misperception that they've learned more during your lecture. Let's talk about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, again, in cognitive psychology, right, there's so many cognitive biases that are known. And it's always the case that it's totally counterintuitive why someone's brain should feel a certain way, that's inconsistent with, let's call it reality or something. So in this case, it turns out that perceived fluency, not just in a lecture, just this happens to us every day. Perceived fluency, we often associate that with effectiveness of how much you're learning from the information that's coming in. Like if someone's giving you directions to go somewhere and you perceive that the information is delivered in a highly fluent manner, then 99% of the time, this will actually be correlated to how much you've actually learned. It actually works. But when you're in a classroom setting, then it starts to break down a little bit.
So in this cases where fluency, where lecturing works, or where one person is talking to another person, works as a way of transmitting information, are those situations where both people are experts? I mean, I think one of these situations here at the university, right? I mean, lecturing, look, you and I can go into a lecture on our specialty and sit down and somebody can lecture to us. We can go to a seminar and be lectured at for an hour and we can really take away a lot of information.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah.
But we're experts. Every word it opens pigeonholes in our head and it lights up our brains in all kinds of ways, right? Because we can make connections because we're experts. But we've got a class full of students who are not experts. They're novices certainly in the material, they're novices. And in reality, they're novices in learning. Although they've been learning all their lives, they're very unaware of how people really learn. Right? We've rarely taught them. We're starting to do more of this now. We're doing more talking about how people learn. Do you see some of this difference between expert talking to expert or expert talking to novice?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are two things here. There's content expertise and there's expert learners. I can think of scenarios where you have someone that has quite a bit of expertise, say in calculus, when you're young and you learn it, and someone's doing quite well, but because you're young, and that was presumably the case for someone like me, you don't have much expertise in how to learn. So then, certain problems would arise there, like the cognitive bias actually would be quite strong. But then I could also think of situations like me where I'm not a content expert when it comes to, say, biochemistry. That's something I would like to learn more about. Mm-hmm. I'm not a content expert, but I'm an expert learner now. So I'm less likely to fall prey to that cognitive bias. That's why there's those two things at play. So when it just so happens that someone like us, who are expert learners, and on top of that, we're content experts, then of course this cognitive bias just doesn't play a role at all.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. I think we forget it's hard to put yourself back in the role of a student. We're sitting in front of a classroom. We're experts. We know this stuff inside and out. You've lectured on this. You've talked about it. You've taught it in whatever format you teach for years. And so it's easy to do. You walk in and you teach, right? And you know this stuff. And you forget that students aren't there.
Yeah. So let me try to say something here that might be very interesting, but if it's clunky, let's just take it out. Yeah. Let me just float this because it is interesting, but it's hard to articulate. What's interesting when we talk about this particular cognitive bias and when it turns on or when it's not there, you also have to think about the cognitive processing. You mentioned that, hey, when we're content expert and we're, expert learners, when I have exchanges with a peer or colleague, I feel like I'm learning a lot. So it turns out that the feeling of learning actually is correlated to actual learning. And that's true. And if you think about the type of cognitive processing that you are able to do while the person is talking, then it turns out that even if the information is actually not delivered really fluently, you have time and space in your mind, if you will, to do pretty effective cognitive processing, which means that the overall perceived fluency of this learning session, let's call it that, is going to be fairly high, and it's going to be correlated to actual learning. Whereas if you're a student, right, where you're not a content expert at something, then the cognitive processing that you're undergoing is really effortful. There's a lot of, should I call it stop and go? where you're struggling to understand what's going on. So it's inherently disfluent. And that's why, like, again, all humans, we have this bias that we perceive fluency as a metacognitive cue if the learning session is effective or not. And that's why a novice in a discipline will often fall prey to that.
Right. And yeah, because learning for novices, a well-constructed, student-centered environment is one in which the students have to struggle.
Yeah.
Right. A well-designed session, students struggle with the content, and it is the struggle that really forces the learning, that really reinforces the learning. First, you got to get there, so you got to figure it out. But once they get there, they have a much deeper understanding than a fluent lecture where you walk them through the steps. They can see it, and they're sitting there taking their notes and going, But 20 minutes later, if you ask them to recapitulate it, they'd say, oh, it was a great lecture. I learned a lot. But if you asked them to restate the lecture, most students would be hard-pressed to do that. Whereas if you ask them to solve a problem again from those who struggled, they know it's going to work hard, but they'll be able to get there better.
Yeah, that's right. Cognitive effort is just inherently disfluent. That's just the way we learn. In cognitive psychology, their experiments are so clean and so well controlled, right? It's in laboratory environment. The information is very as simple as it could be. They have, for example, word pairs like English, Swahili translations, right? And, the learner is being asked to remember 20 of these pairs. And then there's different learning methods and everything. So they even have a word in that field that's called desirable difficulty. They use that word to pinpoint the type of learning method that might actually be effective. That is, if you have a learning technique where there's not a desirable difficulty, which will be perceived as being inherently disfluent, the learning technique just won't be effective. And that's decades of research. And what's interesting is that the most effective learning techniques, again, for retention, right? That's memory research. The most effective techniques, the learner always predicts that they're the least effective.
Right.
So that's very well known. Decades of research.
Right. So we've interviewed Jeff Karpicke, who's done retrieval-based learning.
Oh, yeah, of course. Of course.
Right. Jeff was in the episode in one of his postdocs. Robert Ariel, we've talked about retrieval-based learning and some of these experiments you just alluded to. This notion that they don't think this is the way to learn. They predict that they're not going to do well. And in fact, they do better, of course, when they struggle. And this notion of making things hard, so there's a struggle, but not too hard, right? It's a step, but it's not a giant leap. And it's a step so that students will be able to make that work hard and you can get there. It's the hard work that is required. So interesting. So we've talked a little bit about cognitive fluency. We've been talking about this disconnect, this paradox between what students or what they learn versus their feeling of learning. And we've actually hit on a couple of these topics already. That one, they're novices themselves, so they're not good. They're not good at the metacognition of understanding what they've learned or haven't learned, right?
Yeah, the Kruger-Dunning effect, yeah.
You want to explain the Kruger-Dunning effect?
Yeah, it's just, again, it's a very well-known cognitive bias where, the more novice you are in a certain domain, when you are novice in a domain, you're going to have an inflated sense of how much you understand. And then there's even a curve, right, that shows how this perceived sort of understanding changes as a function of your expertise. And it's very interesting. It's inflated at the beginning, then it goes through a minima as you keep gaining an expertise. And then, of course, it goes back up as you have real expertise. Then, of course, your perception of how much you know should go up, and it does go up. But it goes through a minimum.
So early on, you think you know more than you do know.
Yes, when you're a novice. Yeah.
When you're a novice. And as you move towards expert, there comes a time when you think you know less than you know. You know more than you're assessing yourself.
Yes.
And as you become expert, you become very accurate at assessing your knowledge.
That's correct.
You know a lot, and you also know what you don't know. So you start to be able to accurately, There's a great chapter that I've referred to before in a book called The Invisible Gorilla that uses chess and talks about how chess rating works. And novice chess players overinflate their expertise, and expert players accurately rate their expertise. And since chess players do it numerically, it's very easy to see. It's a fun chapter in that book. Yeah, it's a really fun chapter in that book. Yeah. Okay, so we've got perceived fluency, we've got metacognition, and we've got disfluency is perceived as poor learning, but in fact the disfluency is what's required for learning while you're a novice.
Wait, what did you say?
That the disfluency is perceived as poor learning from the students, right? It makes them uncomfortable in a classroom, the disfluency.
Yes.
They want a fluent situation. They want you to lecture at them. They want to make it easy what they're used to or what our brains do naturally. But it's in fact the disfluency that's required. But the disfluency makes them uncomfortable and makes students rate other forms of learning as better, even though it isn't.
Yeah. But Stephen, I got to say, I prefer to look at it the other way, from the learning sessions that are, given by superstar traditional lecturer, those highly fluent sessions. So, something that troubles me sometimes when people talk to me about how they interpret the paper is that they say, with active learning, students don't like it. With active learning, it's inherently disfluent, and that's why students don't feel like they're learning a lot. The thing I always want to remind people is that students do like active learning if it's implemented well. Number one, they enjoy it. Number two, they do feel that they're learning something from it. But it's just when you compare it to a highly, fluent learning session from a superstar traditional lecturer, that's where the cognitive bias overtakes, your feeling of learning from the active learning.
Okay, that's a good point. So let's move on to your recommendation. So if you're going to do an active learning, in this particular case, in the study you did, students were in a course that was well taught in lots of different ways. It was not a traditional lecture format. For 2 sessions, they had an unusual experiment done to them on learning, and then they moved on back to their course. If you're going to have an active learning course on day 1, you don't want to go half the semester before students start to value the lecturing approach. So you spend some time in this paper talking about recommendations for faculty who are going to have a student-centered classroom in helping students understand the value of that from day 1 so they buy in, and so they don't resist, and so they participate, and so they learn more from day 1, not starting in the middle of the semester, or as you said earlier, a third of the way through the semester, or a quarter, whatever it is your format. Right? Do you want to talk about some of those recommendations you have? Because I think that's really important for people to walk away with something they can take with them, put in practice.
Yeah, of course, a no-brainer is that if students have a hard time assessing how much they're actually learning with active learning, then you just give them, a test early on, like a mini midterm or something like that. It doesn't have to be high stake. So again, anecdotally, whenever I do this, students will often come to me and say, wow, surprising. When I started to study for this, when I studied for it, I didn't feel like I needed to work as hard as in my other courses. I feel like I learned a lot already. Their attitudes change almost immediately. So that's a no-brainer. Another one is to just literally the first week of class, you just talk to them about these notions of perceived fluency will influence, how much you think that you're learning, and that this may not always be correlated to how much you're learning. And I show them evidence from that paper. Gosh, do students respond to that with, I should call it enthusiasm. It's actually amazing. And students have, often told me that this is something they kind of felt, but they could never quite articulate. So that's one reason why they seem to really appreciate someone talking to them about that.
Nice. That's great. One thing that was unique in this paper also was you actually interviewed a bunch of your students after. 11% of your students you interviewed after. So what did you learn from that follow-up with your students?
Yeah, it's one thing to measure these things, but yeah, when you do interviews, it's at the very least, as a researcher, it's comforting, to really hear. When they were, we had structured interviews, obviously, right? Not just chit chat. And the students were asked, a series of questions, and we recorded, their answers to that. So it was 17 students. Yeah. So the things that they cited is, frequent interruptions with the active learning, again, as compared to the highly fluent traditional lectures. Because I always want to remind people of that, because it's okay if there are frequent interruptions in your active learning class. It's fine. Students are going to like it. But if you compare it to the most fluent, delivery you can have in a traditional lecture, then that's where it falls short. All right. So they cited this. They cited that the errors that they made during class would not be corrected. Students are quite sensitive to that, actually. So, obviously, general feeling of, confusion that they have during the active learning, because they're reminded of, what they don't know. So that can sometimes be frustrating. So after commenting on all these results here, the students were all asked the following question, and this is very interesting. They were asked if seeing these results will impact the way that they study, and 14 out of 17 said yes. This would actually change the way they study. Now, I don't know if they actually change, but the fact that, like I said already, that students, they kind of have a feeling that something is not quite right, but they never really articulated it. But when they become aware of it, they say that they're going to change the way they study. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So, are you aware of the very nice study that was published in Science in 2018 by, the last name is, lead author was Staines, Stains, where they just basically surveyed STEM courses across North American universities, and to just see if they use active learning or not, how much of it they use, what kind they use, and so forth. And the results were pretty startling.
You referenced the Staines paper in your paper.
Yeah.
That's I don't know, is it the surprise? Is it the frustration? As I started out the intro, the adoption of active learning, of student-centered practices, is poor. I don't know the details outside of STEM. Certainly inside of STEM, it's poor. We know that these issues are not discipline dependent. Having a student-centered classroom improves learning in all environments, whether it's STEM or not. STEM has known for a long time that student-centered environments are better for students, better for learning, and better for our minoritized, historically excluded students more than anybody, right? They help them disproportionately succeed. And universities struggle with this. They struggle with figuring out how to provide the learning environments needed to help all students. And if we're concerned about diversity and inclusivity, we need to bring everybody along, not fail out or cause our most diverse students to leave whatever field it is and either change fields or not graduate at all. The issues for that are complicated. We're talking about institutional issues, we're talking about motivational issues, and we're talking about students who resist. That's why we're talking about this today, to see that really student resistance is minor. If handled well, and if students are provided with a good learning environment, what I'm hearing from you is that student resistance is not really the issue that people think it is.
That's correct. But yeah, the key is training.
The key is training of both students, that this is going to be okay, this is going to be better.
And faculty.
And the training of faculty, because we talk about active learning, and I've talked about this in other episodes. It's a all-encompassing term, active learning. There's good ways to do it. There's bad ways to do it. I can try to do it your way and I can fail. We all have to learn to do it effectively. And here we are decades later and we're still not doing it. How do you crack that nut?
Yeah, well, one thing I should mention is that, yeah, the Staines paper, right, this large survey published in Science in 2018, yeah, it did show that we still have a long ways to go, but the adoption of active learning is just growing exponentially. And in fact, that's giving rise to new issues now. And one central issue is lack of training. So now more and more I go in classrooms to observe, and I see that students are definitely actively engaged doing something in the classroom, which on the face of it seems good. But then when you pay close attention to what's happening and you compare that to the actual objectives, then you realize, okay, this is not effective.
Right.
So that's lack of training. So that, yeah, that's becoming a very serious issue. But since we're talking about this paper, the PNS paper that I published, I got to tell you, another factor that's really important and that this paper speaks to is this cognitive dissonance that all faculty have, because all of us, when we were younger, as undergraduate students, we all had some experiences where we felt like we learned a lot from lectures. We all had one or two superstar traditional lecturers. So that's why when you're our age and you lecture traditionally and someone comes in and says, hey, look at all the evidence, active learning is actually more effective, there's this cognitive dissonance. You say, all right, I mean, I know there's evidence there, but at the same time, when I was younger, I had experiences for sure where I learned a lot. So anyway, this paper speaks to that, right?
Right. We are a select group that have succeeded and made it into, gotten our degrees, gotten into the academy and gotten to this level. We're a select group. It's inappropriate to put that on our students. They're not us, right? We are who we are. I taught students who had completely different backgrounds from me. If you give it a moment's thought, sure, I can learn. I thought I learned enough. I made it through. I survived. I struggled. But we've got students who don't pass these classes. That's not okay. If we're there to teach all of our students, if we've accepted them into the university, it is our expectation that they can graduate. So when they come into our classes and they fail to progress, they change degrees, they change majors, they withdraw. That's evidence that the modalities we're using or the supports we're providing them are inadequate, or we don't know how to select students, and the students we've selected can't succeed in the university. I think there's plenty of evidence out there that it's not the student's problem. That the students that come in, they come from a variety of different resources. Some less resourced backgrounds, some better resourced backgrounds. But that's not their fault. They come in, and our job is to get them to the finish line. And until we've done everything we can to get them to the finish line, it's not their fault. That's the deficit model. The students come in, they're not succeeding because they can't or they don't. We need to turn that mirror around and look at ourselves and say, what are we doing for them? Are we providing the best learning environments for them? And so even though the difference might be modest between the best lecture in the world and the best active learning environment, they're both learning environments. Students do well in both, but they prefer the lecture. But we know they learn more in an active learning environment, a well-performed active learning environment. Then that active learning environment, it's not going to make a big difference to the students who are getting A's and B's in lectures, but it's going to make a huge difference to those students who are struggling. The C minus, D students, even though grades, that's a whole other question. We've got students who are failing because we're not providing the environment they need to succeed. Also, lives are complicated. These students' lives are complicated. So, until we're providing those best environments, we're not giving our students the best opportunity to continue and persist.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Although you focus a lot on the tail end of the distribution, but the evidence, and there's lots of evidence for that the students say that are on test of learning, right, validated test of learning that score in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, when you switch to a mode of instruction, like a very good, effective type of active learning, I'm trying to remember like the data here, but at least data that we've gathered, the number of students who score in the 90s doubles. So these students are also helped just as much by these more effective teaching methods.
Right. Absolutely. The more effective teaching methods, everybody improves. Those that are struggling often improve more proportionally. Of course, they're further from the limit, right? There's a limit.
Sure.
So everybody improves. But you're right. And why do I focus on those students that are struggling? Because those students are frequently minoritized, marginalized, and historically excluded. So if you want to be inclusive, and if you want to have a more diverse workforce, if you want to have more voices heard, more different voices heard, then that's where you need to focus. The students who are getting A's and B's, they're going to succeed, they're going to persist, they're going to get through. But the students who were C minuses and D's and F's that we're giving those grades to, which again, grading it is in itself a huge problem, but that's the world we're living in right now. Yeah, I do focus on those students because I think that's where you have to look. I think instructors need to take the perspective that every student that doesn't persist in their class or persist in the major or move along, I think they have to look at that as it's not necessarily a personal failure of the instructor, but I think it's important to look at that and ask, have I done everything I can do to help my students succeed? They're not all going to succeed. Students have incredible lives. I had a student once who came in and failed my class, and then the next semester that student came back and got an A. There were things going on in that student's life that student couldn't cope with, and so they failed my class. I don't know that I could have provided anything for that student for that semester. That student came back, but there are so many others that did not pass my class, that I failed, that I'm sure left the field. And I know there are things I could have done better to help more of my students persist and continue on in the academy. And I think faculty need to take a hard look at that. Those A and B students, you could throw them a book and throw them in a closet and they'll pass your tests. They figured it out. They know how to learn. A lot of students have figured that out. Now, maybe they learn more. Maybe they do better, but they'd pass. But the ones who struggle haven't figured it out yet. And they might have never had the resources to help them figure it out. You're right. That is where I focus. I think that's the place to focus. Sorry, that's my rant for the day.
Yeah. No, I do agree, but I'm sure you'll agree with the following, that sure, institutionally, there needs to be a change of culture. Institutions need to focus on these things. I think most people in academic institutions value the things you just mentioned, but to have the actions align with those values, that's a different thing. But on a personal level, I don't mean me, but individual level with faculty, I'm sure it's been your experience that most everyone really care about student learning. They really care about their students. So it is not an issue. At least I found that people care. They really do. They just don't know how to fix these things.
Absolutely. I agree. Faculty care. You don't do this job. It's too hard a job if you don't care about your students, right? That's the reward. But as you said, institutions are structured in all kinds of ways, and there's a lot to talk about there to unpack for another time.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you, let me get a little personal with you, if you don't mind. So you've gone into, you were trained in research, mm-hmm. and you've gone into education research, not physics research. Do you want to talk about that decision of yours? What prompted you to really go down the path of teaching and student-centered classrooms? What happened? What happened along your path that you made that, I'm going to call it a transformation?
Yeah, no, sure. For me, it's very simple. I was on the traditional path to becoming a faculty in my field, which for me was atomic physics. So I did my postdoc, and after my postdoc, it turns out Carl Wyman, who's very well known in science education, he suggested that maybe if I did a year or two of science education and I learned from him, then it would help my academic career. Then I could search for a faculty position and I'd become a better instructor. But then within a year, I was hooked, right? I did not plan on doing science education for the rest of my career, but within a year, I realized, okay. In fact, there's something he had told me before I got started in this that really caught my attention. He'd said, let me remember. He'd said, oh yeah, it's incredibly intellectually stimulating, science education research. Okay, I could buy that. Then he said, I find it to be even more challenging. More rewarding than atomic physics, which was his field of research. That's what he got a Nobel Prize for. And so I could buy that. But then the last thing he said, I remember, he said, I find it more challenging than atomic physics research. That's the part I was like, wait, that's crazy. But coming from him, I knew this had to be right. And yeah, after about a year and a half, I realized, okay, this is amazing. This is amazing. And it's incredibly appealing from the point of view of a STEM researcher. So anyway, so that's why I switched. And I've stayed in the field since.
Was your atomic research with him as a postdoc prior to doing work with him in science education research? Or were you postdocing with somebody else?
It wasn't, but it's a small family that we can all know each other. So so my advisor during my PhD was his former student. So that's why I had met him. I knew him.
I see. So you may not be aware. So Carl Wyman was my first interview in this series.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. We talked about his motivation. It was a very interesting discussion. It was wonderful to talk to him. What a wonderful guy.
Yeah,
I think he really brought a lot of attention, at least certainly within physics and within the sciences, this notion that, hey, this is an important problem. Student learning is an important problem that we need to address. So I think it's great.
Yeah, no, as a community, we're lucky to have him for sure.
Louis, I want to thank you so much for your time today, talking about active learning and the paradox that students learn more in an active classroom, but feel that they learn more in a lecture format, and how we might approach students to help them overcome this misperception. I really appreciate the discussion. I think there's a lot of subtleties here, but I think it's important for faculty to think about these issues every day when they walk into a classroom and engage students, whether it's in the classroom or out of the classroom. I think that's a really important issue. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thanks. That was great. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about?
Well, of course, I've got my little pet things on deliberate practice. It's a mainstay in disciplines like, sports, professional sports. Yeah, but it's almost nowhere to be seen in education. And that's something that I've been thinking about for a long time.
For more information about Dr. Deslauriers, his research and favorite books and papers, please go to our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. Thank you for spending time with us today. Please share our podcast and website with your friends, colleagues, and administrators. We love hearing from our listeners. Write us. Tell us about your favorite episode. Please contact us again through our website. Teaching for Student Success is a production of Teaching for Student Success Media. Let's end this podcast as we always do with some music of Julius H. Some of Julius's music can be found on Pixabay.